Welcome back. Tonight, we're exploring something that might seem simple on the surface, but holds layers of fascinating complexity beneath. We're asking a question that's probably crossed your mind if you've ever toured a cold stone castle or watched a medieval drama where characters huddle under firs. How did people actually sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? When you stand in the ruins of a medieval fortress today, even on a mild summer afternoon, you can feel the chill seeping from those thick stone walls. Imagine that same space in the dead of winter, when frost clings to every surface and your breath turns to mist in the air. No central heating, no electric blankets, no thermostats to adjust, just stone, wind, and whatever warmth you could create with your own hands and ingenuity. The truth is, medieval castles were not the romantic retreats we sometimes imagine. They were functional structures built primarily for defense, and comfort came a distant second to survival and military strategy. The very features that made them nearly impregnable fortresses, those massive stone walls, narrow windows, and strategic positioning on exposed hilltops, also made them brutally cold places to live. But people did live in them. They slept there through harsh winters, raised families, conducted business, and somehow managed to wake up each morning without succumbing to hypothermia. They developed an entire array of strategies, technologies, and social arrangements designed around one simple goal: staying warm enough to survive the night. Before we go deeper into this world of medieval survival, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this kind of historical exploration. And let me know in the comments, have you ever stayed in a castle or historic building? What was it like? Sometimes the stories our ancestors left us are written not in books, but in the very stones they built and the clever ways they adapted to hardship. The architecture of cold. Understanding castle design. To understand how people stayed warm in medieval castles, we first need to understand why these structures were so profoundly cold in the first place. The answer lies in the very nature of their construction, materials that served military purposes exceptionally well, but created significant challenges for daily living. Medieval castles were built from stone, primarily limestone, granite, or whatever local rock was most readily available. These massive walls, often ranging from 8 to 20 feet thick in the most defensive sections, were architectural marvels. They could withstand battering rams, siege engines, and even early artillery. But stone, for all its strength, has a particular relationship with temperature that made life inside quite miserable. Stone has what's called high thermal mass. This means it absorbs temperature slowly and releases it slowly. On a practical level, this created a situation where castle interiors remained cool even on warm days because the stone had absorbed the previous night's chill. During winter, the stone walls became massive cold sinks, absorbing what little warmth existed inside and radiating cold inward. Even with a roaring fire in the Great Hall, you might stand close enough to warm your front while your back remained exposed to the chill emanating from the nearest wall. The windows compounded this problem significantly. Early medieval castles, particularly those built before the 13th century, had extremely narrow window openings called arrow loops or arrow slits. These vertical slits, barely wide enough to shoot an arrow through, were perfect for defense. They allowed archers to fire outward, while presenting almost no target to enemies outside, but they let in precious little light and even less solar warmth. As castle architecture evolved through the High Middle Ages, windows became somewhat larger, particularly in residential areas like the Lord's Solar or the chapel. However, even these larger windows created problems. Glass, when it existed, was an expensive luxury imported from the continent or produced in limited quantities in England and elsewhere. The glass itself was often thick, rippled, and far from clear, reducing the amount of light and heat that could pass through. More commonly, windows in all but the wealthiest castles were simply open holes in the wall, fitted with wooden shutters that could be closed against wind and rain. These shutters, made from oak or other local hardwoods, could be barred from the inside for additional security. When closed against winter storms, they kept out the worst of the wind, but they also plunged the interior into darkness. When open to admit light during the day, they created drafts that whistled through the castle, carrying away any accumulated warmth. Some castle builders attempted to address this by fitting windows with alternatives to glass. Oiled linen or parchment stretched across wooden frames allowed some light through while blocking wind. Animal skins, scraped thin and treated, served a similar purpose. These solutions were better than nothing, but they were far from ideal. The materials degraded quickly, needed frequent replacement, and still allowed significant heat loss. The roofs of medieval castles presented another avenue for heat escape. Unlike the thatched roofs of peasant cottages, which, for all their fire risks and vermin problems, provided decent insulation, castle roofs were typically made of slate, stone tiles, or lead sheeting. These materials were chosen because they wouldn't burn when attackers hurled flaming projectiles, but they conducted cold admirably well. On freezing nights, heat rose to the ceiling and dissipated through the roof, while cold radiated downward. Doors, too, were sources of drafts. The main entrance to a castle might be a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bands, designed to withstand a battering ram. But the seals around these doors were rudimentary at best. Cold air found its way through gaps in the hinges, under the threshold, and through the joins in the planks. Interior doors, when they existed, were often simple affairs, and many doorways were covered only by heavy curtains or leather hangings. The vertical design of castles created additional challenges. Heat rises following the basic laws of physics that medieval people understood empirically, even if they lacked our scientific terminology. In a castle with multiple stories, this meant that upper floors, particularly towers and turrets, were consistently colder than ground-level rooms. Yet many sleeping chambers were located in these upper reaches, placed there for security reasons or simply because that's where space existed. Staircases, whether the spiral stone stairs within towers or straight flights connecting levels, acted as chimneys for heat. Warm air from lower floors rushed upward through these vertical shafts, while cold air descended, creating constant circulation that carried heat away from living spaces. Some castles tried to address this by placing doors at strategic points on stairways, but this only partially solved the problem. The layout of medieval castles also worked against warmth. The Great Hall, which served as the central gathering space, dining room, and often sleeping area for servants and soldiers, was typically a high-ceilinged room designed to impress visitors and accommodate large gatherings. These soaring ceilings looked magnificent and allowed smoke from central hearths to rise above head level, but they also meant that most of the room's volume was filled with cold air. You could have a fire blazing at one end of the hall, and people at the other end would barely feel its warmth. Private chambers, when they existed, were often small rooms built into the thickness of the castle walls, or added as timber structures within larger stone rooms. These smaller spaces were easier to heat than the cavernous hall, but they also had multiple walls exposed to the exterior, increasing the surface area through which heat could escape. Castles built in different regions faced different challenges. Those in northern England, Scotland, or Scandinavia dealt with longer, harsher winters, and had to be designed with some concessions to livability. Many northern castles incorporated slightly smaller rooms, lower ceilings in residential areas, and more generous provision of fireplaces. Mediterranean castles, by contrast, were sometimes built with summer heat in mind, featuring designs that promoted air circulation, which was wonderful in August but less ideal in February. The geographical positioning of castles added another layer of difficulty. Many were built on hilltops, cliff edges, or other elevated positions that provided military advantages. From these heights, defenders could see approaching enemies from miles away. But these exposed positions also meant that castles bore the full force of winter winds. Wind chill, though not understood in modern meteorological terms, was certainly felt, and medieval people knew that a castle on a windswept height was colder than one in a sheltered valley. Some castles were built near bodies of water, whether rivers, lakes, or the sea, which provided both defensive moats and transportation routes. But water also increased humidity and contributed to a pervasive dampness that made the cold feel even more penetrating. Stone walls in these locations would literally weep with condensation, and the moisture would freeze on the coldest nights, creating treacherous conditions inside and out. The very permanence of stone construction meant that architectural mistakes couldn't easily be corrected. If a castle was built with insufficient thought given to winter living, its occupants would suffer for generations. Some features could be added, fireplaces could be installed where none existed before, and walls could be plastered or panelled, but the fundamental character of the structure remained unchangeable. This is why understanding medieval castle sleeping arrangements requires first understanding the profound architectural challenge these buildings presented. The people who lived in them weren't simply dealing with a lack of modern heating technology. They were living in structures specifically designed to be defensible, which often meant they were nearly as hostile to their occupants' comfort as they were to enemy armies. Yet, despite all these obstacles, medieval people found ways to not just survive but to create functioning households, raise families, conduct business and live their lives within these stone fortresses. The remainder of our journey will explore exactly how they managed this feat, starting with their primary weapon against the cold, fire. Primary heat sources, the art and science of fire. Fire was everything in a medieval castle. It was heat, light, cooking power, and a focal point for social life. Without it, castle life would have been literally impossible during winter months. But medieval fire wasn't the convenient, controlled phenomenon we know today. It was dangerous, labour-intensive, and required constant attention. Understanding how medieval people used fire to heat their living spaces is crucial to understanding how they survived cold nights. The earliest medieval castles, particularly those from the 10th and 11th centuries, relied on central hearths. These were essentially open fire pits, usually circular or rectangular areas of stone or hard-packed earth set into the middle of the great hall floor. Wood, and sometimes peat or charcoal, would be burned in these pits, with smoke rising toward a hole in the roof or simply dissipating through the general atmosphere of the hall. Central hearths had significant advantages. They radiated heat in all directions, and people could gather around them from every side. The fire was accessible for cooking, and iron tripods could be set up over it to suspend pots and kettles. In the great hall, where dozens of people might sleep on the floor, a central hearth meant that everyone had relatively equal access to warmth. But the disadvantages were considerable. Smoke was a constant problem. Even with a hole in the roof, much of the smoke would linger in the hall, particularly on still days or when the wind direction pushed it back down. People's eyes would water, lungs would burn, and everything in the hall, furniture, textiles, food, would take on the acrid smell of wood smoke. Clothing worn in a hall with a central hearth would reek of smoke, and that smell was so pervasive that medieval people simply accepted it as normal. The danger of open flames in the middle of a room full of people, many of them drunk by evening's end, cannot be overstated. Accidents happened. Revelers stumbled into the fire, clothing caught alight, sparks leaped from the hearth to ignite the rushes strewn on the floor. Fire was one of the greatest dangers in medieval life, and central hearths, while necessary, contributed significantly to that danger. By the 12th century, a revolution in domestic heating was underway, the development of the wall fireplace and chimney. This technology, which seems simple to us now, represented a major advancement in medieval living conditions. Instead of an open pit in the centre of the room, the fire was confined to a specially built recess in the wall with a hood above to catch smoke and channel it up through a stone chimney that vented outside the building. The first wall fireplaces were simple affairs, little more than enlarged versions of the arrow loops with fire burning in them. But they evolved quickly. By the 13th century, fireplaces had become architectural features in their own right. The opening where the fire burned was fronted by an architrave or frame, often elaborately carved with the owner's coat of arms, biblical scenes, or decorative motifs. The hearth itself, the floor of the fireplace, was paved with stone or tile that could withstand high temperatures. Inside the fireplace, along the back wall, builders often angled the surface to help radiate heat forward into the room. Fire dogs, also called andirons, were iron supports that held logs off the hearth floor, allowing air to circulate beneath and encouraging better burning. Some wealthier households had elaborate decorative fire dogs, wrought in brass or even precious metals, that served both practical and display purposes. The great advantage of wall fireplaces was smoke control. When properly designed, they drew smoke up and out of the living space, making rooms far more comfortable. This allowed for glazed windows, which couldn't have coexisted with central hearths without becoming hopelessly smoked and darkened. Fireplaces also freed up the centre of the room for other purposes, improving the functionality of living spaces. However, wall fireplaces had their own limitations as heating sources. They radiated heat primarily forward into the room. Anyone standing directly in front of a fireplace could roast, while someone across the room might barely feel its warmth. The heat rose straight up the chimney, taking with it much of the fire's energy. And fireplaces required maintenance. Chimneys needed regular cleaning to prevent fires from built-up creosote, and the mortar sealing the stones needed periodic repair. The size of fireplaces varied enormously. In the great hall of a major castle, the fireplace might be large enough for a grown man to walk into, with an opening 6 or 8 feet wide and tall enough to stand upright beneath the hood. Such fireplaces could burn massive logs, whole tree trunks sometimes, that would smoulder for hours. Castle kitchens had similar huge fireplaces, used primarily for cooking but contributing significant heat to their areas. In smaller chambers, fireplaces were more modest, perhaps 3 or 4 feet wide, suitable for smaller logs and coal. Private bedchambers in the wealthiest castles might have their own fireplaces, a luxury that meant the occupant didn't have to leave a warm room to go to bed. But many chambers had no fireplace at all, relying instead on other means of warmth. Managing these fires was a constant task. Servants, often young boys or girls, were assigned to tend the fires throughout the day and, crucially, through the night. Wood needed to be split and carried. Fires needed to be fed regularly to maintain warmth. Coals needed to be raked and spread to ensure even burning. At night, fires in occupied rooms would be banked, meaning they were covered with ash to slow the burning and preserve coals for morning. The morning revival of the fire was an art. A servant would arrive in the pre-dawn darkness, carefully rake away the ash covering the previous night's coals, and hope to find live embers beneath. These would be coaxed back to life with tinder, perhaps dried moss or wood shavings, followed by kindling, small dry twigs and splinters. Only when a flame was established would larger pieces of wood be added. On the coldest mornings, when fires had gone completely out overnight, the process was more laborious, requiring fire to be carried from another room or even struck fresh with flint and steel. Fuel was a significant consideration. Castles consumed enormous quantities of firewood. A single large fireplace could burn through several wheelbarrows of wood in a day during winter. Multiply that by the number of fires burning in a castle, in the great hall, the kitchens, private chambers and guardrooms, and the fuel requirement became staggering. Fortunate castles owned or controlled forests where wood could be harvested. Teams of woodsmen would spend autumn felling trees, splitting logs and transporting them to the castle. Firewood needed to be seasoned, dried for at least a year after cutting, or it would produce more smoke than heat. Castle cellars and courtyards contained huge wood piles, and maintaining adequate fuel supplies for winter was a major logistical challenge. Where wood was scarce, other fuels came into use. Peat, cut from bogs and dried, burned slowly and could maintain a fire through the night, though it produced a distinctive, somewhat unpleasant smell. Coal, mined in various parts of England and Europe, became increasingly common in later medieval periods, particularly in areas where forests had been depleted. Coal burned hotter than wood and required less storage space, but it also produced more dangerous fumes and required better ventilation. Charcoal, produced by slowly burning wood in earthen mounds to drive off moisture and impurities, was another option, particularly for smaller heating needs. It burned cleaner than raw wood and produced excellent heat, but the process of making it was labour-intensive, and it was more expensive than simply burning wood. Beyond stationary fireplaces, medieval castles also used portable braziers. These were metal containers, usually made of brass, bronze or iron, that could be filled with burning charcoal or hot coals and carried from room to room. Braziers came in various designs. Some were simple bowls on tripod legs, while others were elaborate pieces with perforated lids that allowed heat to radiate while containing the coals. The advantage of braziers was flexibility. They could be brought into rooms that lacked fireplaces, providing temporary warmth where it was needed. A brazier could be carried ahead to warm a bedchamber before someone retired for the night, or moved into a workroom where someone needed to spend time during the day. In the Great Hall, multiple braziers could supplement the central hearth or fireplace, helping to spread warmth more evenly. But braziers were also extremely dangerous. An unattended brazier could easily tip over, spilling hot coals onto wooden floors or fabric furnishings. The fumes from burning charcoal, particularly in enclosed spaces, could cause carbon monoxide poisoning, though medieval people wouldn't have understood the chemistry involved. They knew only that breathing too much smoke could make people feel ill, dizzy or worse, and ventilation was essential. History records numerous tragic fires caused by braziers. Perhaps the most famous occurred in 1698, when a maid at Whitehall Palace in London left a brazier unattended while drying laundry. The brazier ignited the linen, and the resulting fire destroyed most of the palace. This happened long after the medieval period, but it illustrates the ongoing dangers these devices presented. Wealthy households employed servants whose specific job was to manage braziers, carrying them where needed, maintaining the coals, and ensuring they didn't create hazards. These servants needed to be responsible and attentive. A burning brazier could not be forgotten or ignored even briefly. The management of fire in medieval castles was thus a complex operation requiring significant labour, resources, and constant vigilance. It wasn't a matter of simply turning on a heater. Every degree of warmth was earned through someone's physical effort, whether that was the woodsman who felled and split the logs, the servant who carried them to the fireplace, the person who tended the fire through the day and night, or the castle steward who managed the massive fuel supplies required to keep a household warm through winter. Understanding this context helps us appreciate the other strategies medieval people used to stay warm. Because even with fires burning, even with the best managed hearths and the most generous supply of fuel, castles remained cold places. The fire could push back the worst of the chill, creating zones of relative comfort. But it couldn't heat the vast stone volumes of these buildings to anything approaching modern standards of warmth. Additional methods were essential for survival. The noble bedchamber, luxury in layers. When we think about medieval nobility, we often imagine lives of comfort and ease, and compared to peasants sleeping on straw in one-room cottages, nobles certainly had advantages. But even the wealthiest inhabitants of medieval castles faced the same fundamental challenge. how to stay warm enough to sleep without freezing. The solution lay not in a single innovation, but in the accumulation of many layers of luxury, each adding a small measure of warmth until, combined, they created a tolerable sleeping environment. At the heart of noble sleeping arrangements was the bed itself, and what a bed it was. The great beds of medieval nobility were expensive, elaborate pieces of furniture, often among the most valuable items a family owned. These beds were mentioned specifically in wills, bequeathed from generation to generation, and sometimes moved from castle to castle when the family travelled. The foundation of a noble bed was its frame, typically constructed from oak or another durable hardwood. 4 substantial posts rose from the corners, sometimes reaching 8 or 9 feet in height. These posts were often carved with decorative motifs, spirals, geometric patterns, or scenes from nature. The skill of the carpenter who created the bed frame was a matter of pride and a display of the family's wealth. Between these posts, wooden rails connected the frame. Across these rails, rope was woven in a tight pattern, creating a flexible support surface. This rope, usually hemp, needed regular tightening because it stretched with use and weight. The expression "sleep tight" originates from this practice of tightening bed ropes to maintain a firm sleeping surface. A servant would use a special tool, essentially a large wooden pin, to twist and tighten the ropes, winding them to increase tension. This was a regular maintenance task, typically done weekly or whenever the bed began to sag noticeably. On top of this rope foundation came the mattresses, plural because a proper noble bed had multiple layers. The bottommost mattress was typically stuffed with straw or hay. This provided a thick, insulating base layer that separated the sleeper from the ropes beneath. Straw mattresses were scratchy, lumpy, and needed regular replacement as the straw broke down and compressed, but they served an important purpose. Above the straw mattress came a second mattress, this one usually stuffed with wool. Wool, sheared from the castle's own sheep or purchased from wool merchants, was carded to align the fibres and then stuffed into large linen or canvas ticks, basically large bags with the open end sewn shut. Wool was warmer than straw, softer, and provided better insulation. It was also more expensive, but for nobility, this was an acceptable cost. The topmost mattress, the one the sleeper actually lay upon, was the finest of all, the feather bed. This was a tick stuffed with goose or duck down, the soft, fluffy underfeathers that trapped air and provided excellent insulation. A good feather bed was light, soft, and wonderfully warm. The down compressed under the sleeper's weight but puffed up around them, creating a cocoon of warmth. Feather beds were expensive, requiring the down from many birds to fill a single bed. They were so valued that they were sometimes listed separately in household inventories, distinguished from the other mattresses and bedding. Some wealthy households had multiple feather beds, allowing them to rotate them seasonally or move them between residences. On top of these mattresses came the linens. First, linen sheets, usually 2 of them. The bottom sheet covered the feather bed, while the top sheet covered the sleeper. Linen was the preferred material for sheets because it was smooth against the skin, unlike scratchy wool, and it could be washed frequently. The production of linen was labour-intensive, involving the growing, harvesting and processing of flax, but the result was a fabric prized throughout medieval society. Sheets were often made in several pieces sewn together because looms of the period couldn't produce cloth wide enough for a bed in one piece. The stitching was done carefully to create flat seams that wouldn't irritate the sleeper. In wealthy households, sheets might be marked with the family's initials or embroidered with decorative borders. Over the top sheet came blankets. These were usually wool woven thick and heavy. A bed might have multiple blankets, layered according to the season and the sleeper's preference. In the depths of winter, some beds had as many as 5 or 6 blankets piled on. The weight of these blankets, often considerable, helped hold in the sleeper's body heat and created a sense of security. Fur coverlets added another layer of both warmth and status. The wealthiest nobles might have coverlets lined with ermine, the white winter fur of stoats, which was associated with royalty. Others used rabbit, fox, or beaver fur. These coverlets were extraordinarily warm, and the pelts were carefully preserved and cleaned. A fur coverlet could last for generations if properly maintained. At the head of the bed lay pillows. Medieval pillows were quite different from modern ones. A bolster, essentially a long cylindrical pillow, typically stretched the full width of the bed. This bolster, stuffed with feathers or sometimes wool, provided support for the neck and head. On top of the bolster might be one or two smaller square pillows, also feather-filled. Like the feather bed itself, good pillows were valuable items. But the true innovation of the noble bed, the feature that transformed it from merely comfortable to genuinely warm, was the addition of curtains and canopy. The 4 tall bedposts we mentioned earlier weren't just decorative. They supported a framework from which curtains could be hung, completely enclosing the bed. These bed curtains, also called bed hangings, were made from heavy fabric, often wool, thick linen, or in the wealthiest households, silk or velvet. They hung from the canopy framework, which might be a simple wooden frame or an elaborate structure, and descended on all 4 sides of the bed. When closed, they created a small, enclosed space that trapped heat and provided both physical and psychological privacy. The practical benefits of bed curtains were immense. They blocked drafts that might sweep through the chamber. They held in the warmth generated by the sleeper's body, transforming the space within the curtains into a much warmer microclimate than the room beyond. On the coldest nights, the temperature inside the enclosed bed might be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than the room outside. But bed curtains provided more than warmth. In an era where privacy was rare and valuable, they created a private space where a noble couple could converse, be intimate, or simply sleep without being observed by the servants, who might be sleeping elsewhere in the same chamber. They also served as a status symbol. Elaborately embroidered or decorated curtains displayed the family's wealth and taste. The fabrics used for bed hangings varied with the seasons. Summer curtains might be lighter linen, allowing more air circulation. Winter curtains were heavy wool or even layered fabrics, providing maximum insulation. Some households had multiple sets of hangings that were changed seasonally, a major undertaking requiring servants to take down one set, clean and store it, and hang the new set. The inside surfaces of bed curtains were sometimes decorated. Embroidery was common, with motifs ranging from geometric patterns to narrative scenes. Some curtains featured the family's heraldic symbols, reinforcing identity and status even in the private space of the bed. The very wealthy might have curtains of fabric woven with gold or silver threads, creating a shimmering effect in candlelight. The canopy itself, the horizontal fabric that covered the top of the bed, served to prevent drafts from above and to catch heat rising from the bed below. It also prevented dust, insects, and debris from falling onto the sleepers, a real concern in rooms with timber ceilings where birds, mice, and various insects made their homes in the rafters. This entire elaborate structure, the bed frame, the multiple mattresses, the linens, blankets, furs, and curtains, represented a significant investment. A complete set of furnishings for a great bed could cost as much as a year's income for a prosperous merchant. For nobility, the bed was often the single most expensive piece of furniture they owned. Because of this value, beds were often portable, or at least semi-portable. The frame could be disassembled, the mattresses and curtains packed into chests, and the whole assembly transported when the family moved between residences. This was a major logistical operation, requiring servants, carts, and careful packing. but it allowed noble families to maintain their accustomed level of comfort wherever they went. The chamber in which this grand bed resided was itself designed, when possible, to promote warmth. Private chambers for nobility were often smaller than the Great Hall, making them easier to heat. Many had their own fireplaces, allowing the occupants to maintain a fire through the night. The walls might be hung with fabric, essentially large curtains or true woven tapestries, which provided both decoration and insulation. Windows in bedchambers were kept small and were fitted with shutters that could be tightly closed at night. In the wealthiest rooms, windows might have glass, often small panes set in lead framing, which admitted light during the day while providing better insulation than open shutters. Heavy curtains could be drawn across windows at night for additional draught protection. The floor of a noble bedchamber might be covered with rugs or woven rush mats, providing insulation from the cold stone below. In the very wealthiest chambers, imported carpets from the East might be used, though these were so expensive that they were sometimes hung on walls rather than walked upon. Despite all these measures, a noble bedchamber in winter remained cold by modern standards. The fireplace might warm the area immediately around it, but the rest of the room could be quite chilly. Getting into bed required speed and determination, shedding warm outer garments and diving quickly under the covers before the cold could penetrate. Emerging in the morning was similarly bracing. A servant would hopefully have already revived the fire, but the room would still be cold enough that breath misted in the air. Nobles dealt with this by keeping certain garments on for sleep. While some might sleep nude in summer, winter sleeping typically involved keeping on a linen undertunic, or, in later periods, a specific sleeping gown. A nightcap or coif kept the head warm, important because so much body heat is lost through the head. Some nobles even kept light shoes or slippers near the bed so they wouldn't have to place bare feet on cold stones when they rose. The morning routine involved servants bringing warm water for washing, usually heated over the chamber fire or brought from the kitchen. Even this small comfort required labour and planning. Someone had to carry water, heat it, and transport it to the chamber at just the right time. For all the luxury and layering, even noble sleep in medieval castles remained a survival exercise, requiring careful preparation and significant resources. But if nobles, with all their advantages, still struggled with the cold, imagine the challenges faced by everyone else in the castle household, the servants, soldiers, and workers who lacked access to feather beds, fur coverlets, and private chambers with fireplaces. Servants and lower classes, sleeping on the margins. While nobles retired to their enclosed beds and private chambers, the vast majority of people in a medieval castle faced very different sleeping conditions. Servants, soldiers, lower-level household staff, and various workers who kept the castle functioning had to find rest wherever space and circumstances allowed. Their experience of sleeping in a medieval castle reveals the harsh realities of social hierarchy and the extreme resourcefulness required for survival. The Great Hall served as the communal sleeping space for much of the castle's population. During the day, this massive room bustled with activity. Meals were served, business was conducted, guests were received, and the general life of the castle played out. But as darkness fell, the hall transformed into a dormitory of sorts, though calling it that suggests more organisation than usually existed. Servants who slept in the Great Hall had no permanent sleeping spots. After the evening meal was cleared away, and the trestle tables dismantled or pushed to the sides, people simply claimed whatever space they could find. Some spread pallets on the floor. These were thin mattresses, barely worthy of the name. Essentially canvas or rough fabric bags stuffed with straw, old rags, or wool scraps. A pallet provided minimal cushioning against the hard stone or wooden floor and offered little insulation from the cold radiating upward from below. Those who lacked even a pallet, and many did, would wrap themselves in whatever coverings they possessed. A lucky servant might have a rough woolen blanket, heavy, scratchy, and none too clean, but warm enough to make a difference. Others made do with their cloaks or capes, the very garments they'd worn during the day, now repurposed as bedding. Some had nothing but the clothes they stood in. The strategic positioning of one's sleeping spot became crucial for survival. The area immediately around the hearth or fireplace was premium real estate, warm but also crowded and subject to sparks and smoke. Higher-ranking servants, those with more seniority or specific favour with the Lord, could claim these warmer spots. Lower-ranking servants found themselves pushed to the periphery, where cold from the stone walls penetrated despite the presence of a fire in the centre. This wasn't simply uncomfortable, it could be dangerous. On the coldest nights, those sleeping far from the fire genuinely risked hypothermia. The solution, practiced out of sheer necessity, was to huddle together. Bodies crowded close, sharing warmth in a practice that ignored personal space entirely. Groups of servants would sleep nearly on top of each other, their combined body heat creating a warmer microclimate than any individual could maintain alone. Modern sensibilities might find this arrangement shocking, but medieval people viewed it pragmatically. Warmth trumped privacy every time. Men and women were typically segregated, male servants sleeping in one area, female servants in another, often on opposite sides of the hall or in different locations entirely. But within these gender-segregated spaces, physical closeness wasn't just accepted, it was necessary. The composition of the great hall sleepers varied. Young pages, boys from noble families sent to other castles to learn courtesy and service, might sleep here alongside kitchen workers, stable hands, and soldiers of the garrison. The hierarchy persisted even in sleep. Higher-ranking pages might get pallets while scullions made do with straw on the floor, but everyone was together in the communal space. Knights and squires, though technically part of the military rather than servant class, also often slept in the Great Hall, particularly in castles without separate quarters for the garrison. They might be assigned a specific area, perhaps curtained off for a modicum of privacy, but they still shared the general space and its challenges. A knight might have a slightly better mattress and his own blanket, perhaps even a small brazier brought nearby, but he wasn't spared the general cold and discomfort. Beyond the Great Hall, servants found sleep in whatever spaces existed. Kitchen servants might bed down in the kitchen itself, near the massive hearth that was kept burning nearly continuously. This was warm, certainly warmer than most other options, but it came with its own problems. The kitchen was busy from before dawn, when the first fire was stoked for breakfast, until late at night after the last meal was cleared. Those sleeping there had almost no uninterrupted rest. The kitchen's warmth also attracted vermin. Rats, mice, and insects thrived in the warmth and amid the food scraps inevitably present, despite efforts at cleanliness. Sleeping in the kitchen meant sharing space with these creatures, a fact of life that medieval people accepted but certainly didn't enjoy. Cats were kept specifically to control rodent populations, but they couldn't eliminate the problem entirely. Stables housed not just horses, but also the grooms and stable hands who tended them. Sleeping in the stables meant dealing with the smell and noise of horses, but it also meant access to hay, which could be piled thick enough to create a moderately comfortable sleeping surface. The large animals generated significant body heat, warming the stable environment. On the coldest nights, sleeping among horses might actually be preferable to sleeping in an unheated chamber elsewhere. Some castles had lofts or gallery spaces above the Great Hall or other rooms, essentially attic areas where servants could spread pallets. These spaces were cramped, often barely tall enough to stand in, and filled with stored items, but they offered some separation from the bustle below. The disadvantage was that these upper spaces, being furthest from any heat source, were brutally cold. Towers and wall chambers, The small rooms built into the thickness of castle walls sometimes housed servants. A favoured servant, perhaps a personal attendant to the lord or lady, might be given a tiny chamber near their master's quarters. This was a privilege, granting privacy and proximity to the warmer areas of the castle, but the rooms themselves were seldom heated and could be quite cold. Personal servants of high-ranking nobles sometimes slept in their master's chamber, though not in the bed. A trundle or truckle bed, a low frame on wheels that could be rolled under the master's bed during the day, provided sleeping space for a body servant. This arrangement benefited both parties. The servant was available if needed during the night, and the presence of another warm body in the room added a small amount of heat. Some castles built separate servants' quarters, typically wooden structures in the bailey or courtyard. These might be long, narrow buildings with sleeping pallets arranged along the walls and a central fireplace. Compared to sleeping in the Great Hall, this offered more space and better organisation, but the buildings themselves were often drafty and minimally heated. Servants might prefer the crowded warmth of the Great Hall to the organised cold of a separate building. During the winter, servants faced a grinding routine centred on staying warm enough to function. They'd wake in the cold, often in darkness, and immediately begin work that was itself physically demanding and helped them warm up. Carrying water, splitting wood, tending fires, these tasks generated body heat even as they served the castle's needs. The brief rest periods during the day might be spent near fires, soaking up warmth while possible. Meals provided not just nutrition, but also internal warmth. Hot porridge, thick soups, bread, all of these helped raise and maintain body temperature. The ale or weak beer that was the common drink was often heated in winter, creating a warming beverage that, while low in alcohol, provided calories and comfort. Clothing for servants was practical and layered. A linen undertunic touched the skin, absorbing sweat and oils. Over this went a woolen tunic, the primary garment, and perhaps a second woolen layer or a sleeveless overtunic. The outermost layer might be a cloak or heavy cape. At night, servants often slept in most or all of these layers, removing at most the outermost garments. The layers trapped air and provided insulation, using the same principle as modern layered clothing systems. Footwear presented challenges. The fortunate had leather shoes or boots, which provided some insulation and protection. The less fortunate made do with cloth wrapped around their feet. At night, most removed their footwear to allow it to dry near the fire, a necessary practice since wet footwear could lead to frostbite. But this meant waking to frozen feet and the unpleasant task of putting on cold, stiff shoes. Head coverings were nearly universal for sleeping. A linen coif or cap kept the head warm and also kept hair clean and out of the way. Women might braid their hair and cover it with a cloth or kerchief. Men too wore caps to bed. The universality of this practice speaks to its effectiveness. Keeping the head covered genuinely helped retain body heat. The morning wake-up for servants was harsh. Someone, usually a junior servant or page, would be tasked with rising first to tend fires throughout the castle. This unfortunate individual would leave whatever warmth they'd accumulated through the night, moving from room to room in the pre-dawn cold, raking coals, adding fuel, and trying to revive flames that had burned low or gone out entirely. As fires came back to life, other servants would gradually stir, drawn by the promise of warmth. The process of getting everyone up and working could take an hour or more, a sluggish, cold start to what would be a long working day. The hope of a warm meal, of hot food and heated drink motivated people to rise and begin their tasks. Illness was a constant risk. Living in cold, crowded conditions with inadequate bedding made servants vulnerable to respiratory ailments, fevers, and other cold-related illnesses. A sick servant faced a difficult situation. Too ill to work, but with no comfortable place to recuperate. Some castles had a dedicated room for sick servants, though this was far from universal. More often, a sick person would simply remain in their usual sleeping spot, relying on the charity and limited care their fellow servants could provide. The resilience required to live this way year after year is difficult for us to fully appreciate. Medieval servants didn't have a choice about their sleeping arrangements. They couldn't opt out of service, couldn't demand better conditions, couldn't simply leave for a more comfortable situation. They adapted because they had to, developing tolerance for cold and discomfort that would be remarkable by modern standards. Yet even in these harsh conditions, some small comforts existed. Servants formed close bonds with one another, relationships forged in shared hardship. They told stories, sang songs, and shared the small joys available to them. The warmth of human connection, if it couldn't substitute for physical warmth, at least made the cold more bearable. The contrast between the sleeping conditions of nobles and servants was stark and visible to everyone in the castle. When servants entered noble chambers to tend fires or bring water, they saw the elaborate beds, the warm chambers, the comfortable arrangements. This visible inequality was simply accepted as the natural order, part of the divinely ordained hierarchy of medieval society. Everyone knew their place, and that place determined not just their status, but their very physical comfort and survival through the winter months. Bed warmers and portable heat. Medieval people weren't content to rely solely on ambient heat from fireplaces and body warmth. They developed specific technologies designed to bring heat directly to the bed, creating pockets of warmth that made the transition to sleep more bearable. These devices, while simple by modern standards, represented significant innovation and played a crucial role in making medieval sleeping arrangements survivable. The bed warmer, also called a warming pan, was perhaps the most iconic of these devices. It consisted of a shallow metal pan, usually brass or copper for wealthy households, or iron for more modest ones, attached to a long wooden handle. The pan itself was typically circular, ranging from 8 to 14 inches in diameter, with a hinged lid that could be opened to add fuel and closed to contain it during use. The design of warming pans showed considerable thought. The metal pan conducted heat well, radiating warmth from both its bottom surface and its lid. Many warming pans had decorative perforations in the lid, punched in patterns that were both beautiful and functional. These holes allowed oxygen to reach the coals inside, keeping them alive and hot, while also allowing some heat to radiate directly upward. The patterns on warming pan lids ranged from simple geometric designs to elaborate scenes. Some featured floral motifs, others heraldic symbols, and some depicted biblical or classical scenes. For wealthy families, a warming pan was not just a functional tool but a display piece, hung near the fireplace where visitors could admire it and where it would be conveniently located for use. The handle of a warming pan was crucial to its functionality. Made of wood, usually turned and polished, it needed to be long enough to allow the user to reach the far side of a bed without leaning awkwardly, typically 3 to 4 feet in length. The wood insulated the user's hand from the heat of the pan, and the handle often ended in a turned knob or other decorative feature that made it easier to grip. Using a warming pan required a specific procedure. In the evening, usually about an hour before the bed would be used, a servant would take the pan to the kitchen or great hall where fires were burning. The lid would be opened and hot coals would be scooped from the fire into the pan. Not just any coals would do, they needed to be well-established coals that would stay hot for an extended period without generating excessive flame or smoke. Sometimes ash would be mixed with the coals to moderate their heat and make them last longer. The lid would then be closed, securing the coals inside. The servant, carrying the warming pan by its long handle, would make their way to the bedchamber. The pan needed to be kept level to prevent coals from spilling, and the walk through cold corridors would often make the metal pan even hotter, as the contrast with the surrounding air increased heat radiation. Once at the bed, the warming pan would be slipped between the sheets, typically between the top linen sheet and the first blanket. The servant would then move the pan back and forth, slowly working across the bed, allowing the heat to penetrate the fabric layers. This wasn't a quick process. Properly warming a large bed could take 10 to 15 minutes of careful movement, ensuring every area received heat. The warmth from the pan dried any dampness in the sheets, a real benefit in cold, humid castles where fabric could absorb moisture from the air. It also heated the mattresses and blankets, creating a warm nest for the sleeper. By the time the warming pan was removed, the bed felt genuinely warm, a shocking and pleasant contrast to the cold room. But warming pans came with significant risks. Hot coals could escape through worn seams or damaged lids, burning sheets or even setting them alight. Many castles experienced fires that began with warming pans. The historical record documents numerous incidents. A warming pan left unattended, coals spilling onto straw pallets, curtains ignited by a carelessly handled pan. The danger was significant enough that the use of warming pans required trained, responsible servants. A young or careless servant might be forbidden from handling warming pans, the risk being too great. In larger households, specific servants were designated for this task, people who had proven their reliability and understood the dangers involved. As a result of these fire risks, some households eventually transitioned to sealed warming pans. These had no perforations, creating a closed container for the coals. While safer from a fire standpoint, sealed pans didn't heat as effectively because oxygen couldn't reach the coals, and they cooled more quickly. Some families considered this an acceptable trade-off for increased safety. An alternative to coal-filled warming pans emerged: water-based warmers. A sealed copper or brass container could be filled with boiling water, creating a hot water bottle of sorts. These were safer than coal-based warmers and could still provide significant heat. The disadvantage was that water cooled more quickly than coals, so a water-based warmer might only stay effectively warm for an hour or two. Beyond formal warming pans, medieval people used more improvised heat sources. Heated stones or bricks, warmed at the fire and wrapped in cloth, could be placed in beds. These had been used since ancient times and remained popular because they required no specialized equipment. A large stone heated thoroughly could stay warm for several hours. Multiple stones placed throughout a bed could create a genuinely warm sleeping environment. The procedure for using heated stones was straightforward but labor-intensive. Large, smooth river stones or purpose-shaped bricks would be set near a fire, close enough to heat through, but not so close as to risk cracking from thermal shock. After an hour or more, when the stone was thoroughly hot, it would be wrapped in several layers of cloth or placed in a fabric bag to prevent direct contact with skin or fabric. These wrapped stones could then be positioned in the bed, one at the feet, others along the body's length, creating warm spots throughout. The advantage was simplicity and safety. A well-wrapped stone couldn't burn or start a fire. The disadvantage was that stones were heavy and awkward to move, particularly when multiple stones were needed for a large bed. Some households developed more sophisticated stone warming systems. Purpose-built chambers near fireplaces could hold multiple stones at once, keeping a supply of hot stones ready. Servants could then quickly wrap and transport stones to various bedchambers as needed. This systematized approach made warming beds more efficient in castles where multiple chambers needed preparation each night. Foot warmers, smaller versions of bed warmers, were used for targeted heat. These were small metal or ceramic containers that could be filled with hot coals or water and placed under blankets at the foot of the bed. Keeping feet warm was particularly important. Cold feet could make falling asleep difficult, even when the rest of the body was relatively comfortable. Some foot warmers were elaborate, beautifully crafted objects that could be used during waking hours as well. A person sitting in a cold room might place their feet on a foot warmer, absorbing heat through the soles of their shoes or directly if they were barefoot. These devices were particularly popular with elderly people and those who worked at sedentary tasks where they couldn't move around to stay warm. In the wealthiest households, a system developed where servants maintained a rotation of heated objects through the night. A brazier might be kept burning in an antechamber, and servants would periodically re-warm stones or replace cooling foot warmers with freshly heated ones. This level of service was extremely rare, limited to royalty and the highest nobility, but it demonstrates how far people would go to create comfortable sleeping conditions. The bed-warming ritual became part of the evening routine in noble households. It signalled that the day was ending and rest was approaching. The arrival of a servant with a warming pan was a cue to begin preparing for bed, removing outer garments, and attending to final tasks. There was even a psychological component. The process of warming the bed, the anticipation of warmth, and the ritual nature of the activity may have helped people mentally prepare for sleep. But for servants themselves, access to bed warmers was limited or non-existent. A favoured personal servant might have a warming pan used on their pallet, particularly if they were sleeping in a private chamber where the risk of fire could be more easily managed. But most servants sleeping in communal areas had no such luxury. The risk of fire in the crowded, straw-filled Great Hall was too great to allow warming pans there. This created yet another division between classes. Nobles settled into pre-warmed beds, while servants huddled under cold blankets, hoping their own body heat would eventually warm their sleeping spaces. The availability of bed warmers, like so much else in medieval castles, reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy. The importance of these warming devices can't be overstated. In a world without central heating, without electric blankets, without even the ability to simply turn up a thermostat, bringing heat directly to the bed was a significant comfort. It made the difference between a merely cold night and a potentially dangerous one. The warmth might only last a few hours, but those hours at the beginning of the night were when people were most conscious of the cold, most aware of the transition from activity to rest. By providing warmth during that crucial period, bed warmers and heated stones made medieval sleeping conditions tolerable. Yet even with these aids, sleeping in a medieval castle remained a challenge, particularly in the deepest part of winter when even the most generous warming efforts could barely push back the cold. Additional strategies were necessary, and medieval people employed every trick they could devise to survive the night. Layered defences, clothing, textiles and insulation. Beyond fire and heated objects, medieval people relied heavily on the strategic use of textiles and clothing to create insulating barriers against the cold. These measures, applied at multiple scales from personal garments to room-sized curtains, work together to trap heat and block drafts, creating survivable sleeping conditions even in the coldest castles. The question of what medieval people wore to bed is more complex than it might initially appear. Modern assumptions about sleepwear don't necessarily apply to the medieval period, and practices varied by time period, social class, and regional custom. However, certain patterns emerge from historical evidence. In the early Middle Ages, many people, including some nobles, slept entirely nude. This practice might seem counterintuitive given the cold, but it had its logic. Medieval people spent their days in clothing that accumulated dirt, sweat, and odours. Removing everything at night allowed the skin to breathe and the clothing to air out. More importantly, sleeping nude meant that body heat wasn't wasted warming daytime clothes that couldn't be washed easily. However, this nude sleeping typically occurred under many layers of blankets and coverings. The person might be naked, but they were buried under wool, linen and furs, creating an insulated cocoon. Body heat trapped by these layers warmed the space within the bed. As long as the person remained under the covers, this arrangement could be quite warm. The problem came with any need to leave the bed during the night. By the late Middle Ages, dedicated sleeping garments became more common, particularly among the wealthy. These nightshirts or sleeping gowns were typically made of linen, the same fabric used for undergarments. Linen had several advantages for sleepwear. It was soft against the skin, relatively easy to wash, and it wickeded moisture away from the body, preventing the clammy feeling that could come from sweating under heavy blankets. A typical nightshirt for a man was essentially an elongated version of the daytime undertunic, reaching to mid-thigh or knee length. It had long sleeves and a simple neck opening, often with ties or buttons. Women's nightgowns were similar but typically longer, reaching to the ankles. These garments were loose and flowing, allowing freedom of movement while providing a thin layer of insulation. The wealthy might have multiple nightshirts or gowns, allowing them to be rotated and washed regularly. The very wealthy might even have sleeping garments made from finer linen or, rarely, silk. But for most people, a single sleeping garment that was washed every few weeks was the norm. However, many medieval people, particularly servants and poorer folk, couldn't afford dedicated sleeping garments. Instead, they slept in their undergarments, the same linen tunics or chemises worn beneath daytime clothes. This practice saved money and meant fewer garments needed washing. The person would remove outer woolen layers, perhaps a tunic or gown, but keep the linen layer on for warmth and modesty. In the coldest weather, particularly for those sleeping in unheated spaces, keeping more clothes on was practical. A servant sleeping in a drafty corner of the Great Hall might sleep in full daytime dress, removing only an outer cloak. The multiple layers of wool provided insulation, and the person could wake and begin work immediately, without the shock of dressing in the cold. Monks and other religious figures often slept fully dressed in their habits, as specified by monastic rules. This practice ensured they could quickly respond to the call for midnight prayers without fumbling with clothes in the dark. It also reflected religious values around modesty and discipline. Though initially practical, the practice of sleeping clothed became associated with piety and asceticism. Nearly universal across all classes was the use of head coverings for sleep. Caps, coifs, or kerchiefs kept the head warm, and medieval people correctly understood that significant body heat was lost through the head. A simple linen cap, tied under the chin or secured with a band, was standard nighttime attire for both men and women. Women's nighttime head coverings served additional purposes. By braiding hair and covering it, women kept their hair clean and prevented the tangles that would otherwise occur during sleep. In an era when bathing was infrequent and hair washing a major undertaking, this was an important practical measure. Some women wore more elaborate arrangements, with linen veils pinned in place, both for warmth and to maintain proper appearance even in sleep. Beyond clothing worn on the body, textile barriers played a crucial role in castle sleeping arrangements. Wall hangings, broadly referred to as tapestries, though not all were technically tapestries in the woven sense, were among the most important of these barriers. True tapestries, woven on large looms with elaborate pictorial or decorative designs, were expensive luxury items. They depicted hunting scenes, biblical narratives, classical myths, or heraldic symbols. But their beauty was almost secondary to their practical function. Hung on stone walls, tapestries created an air gap between the cold wall surface and the room's interior. This trapped air provided insulation, significantly reducing the heat-sucking effect of bare stone. Not all wall hangings were elaborate tapestries. Simpler painted or embroidered cloths, sometimes just heavy wool fabric, served similar purposes. The key was creating that insulating air layer. Castles would have different sets of hangings for summer and winter, with heavier, thicker materials brought out as temperatures dropped. Installing wall hangings was a major undertaking. The cloths needed to be attached securely to walls that might not offer good anchor points. Wooden battens might be fixed to the walls, or iron rings driven into mortar joints from which the hangings could be suspended. In some rooms, entire wooden frameworks were constructed, creating a room within the stone room, with fabric stretched across the frame. The effect of proper wall hangings could be dramatic. A room with bare stone walls might be miserably cold, while the same room with heavy textile coverings could be tolerably comfortable. The difference might be 10 or 15 degrees, enough to move from dangerously cold to merely unpleasant. This is why wealthy nobles invested heavily in wall hangings, and why these textiles were valuable enough to be listed in wills and inventories. Windows received similar textile treatment. Heavy curtains, made from wool or layered linen, could be drawn across windows at night. These blocked drafts from poorly sealed shutters and provided another layer of insulation. The curtains trapped air between themselves and the window, creating an insulating buffer zone. Some window curtains were quite elaborate, matching the room's other textiles and bearing decorative elements. Others were purely functional, plain fabric chosen for thickness and draft-blocking ability. Either way, closing curtains at night was an important part of preparing a room for sleep. Floor coverings added yet another insulating layer. Rushes, cut from riverside plants and strewn across floors, were common in great halls and everyday spaces. These provided a soft surface to walk on and, more importantly, a layer of insulation between feet and cold stone. Fresh rushes were aromatic, and they helped mask some of the less pleasant smells of medieval life. However, they required frequent replacement as they became compressed and soiled. More permanent floor coverings included woven rush mats, essentially large flat baskets that could be laid on the floor and later rolled up for cleaning. These were more durable than loose rushes and could be removed and beaten to shake out dust and debris. True carpets, woven textiles specifically designed for floors, were extremely rare and expensive in medieval Europe. Most came from the Islamic world, imported at great cost. These were so valuable that they were often hung on walls or draped over furniture, rather than walked upon. But in the wealthiest households, particularly in private chambers, Oriental carpets might indeed be laid on the floor, where they provided both beauty and insulation. More common were rough woolen rugs, locally made and far less decorative than imported carpets. These served the same insulating function, trapping air and providing a barrier between feet and cold floors. They were particularly valuable near beds, giving people a warmer surface to step onto when rising in the morning. Bed curtains, discussed earlier in the context of noble sleeping arrangements, deserve further attention as textile barriers. The heavy fabrics used for these curtains created an enclosed space that could be remarkably different in temperature from the surrounding room. Inside closed bed curtains, a sleeper's body heat would slowly warm the enclosed air. Because the space was small, relatively little heat was needed to make a noticeable difference. This microclimate effect was the bed curtain's greatest contribution to warmth. Even if the bedchamber itself remained cold, the space within the curtains could become warm enough for comfortable sleep. This is why bed curtains remained standard in cold climates well into the early modern period, only disappearing when better heating technologies and building insulation made them unnecessary. Some bed curtains had additional features to enhance their warmth. Interlining, adding a layer of wool batting between the decorative outer fabric and the lining, created even better insulation. The resulting curtains were heavy, difficult to handle, and required strong hardware to support their weight, but they were dramatically more effective at retaining heat. The strategic deployment of all these textile barriers required knowledge and effort. Servants responsible for preparing rooms for sleep needed to know which hangings to use, how to properly arrange them, and how to maintain them. This was skilled work, and experienced servants who could efficiently prepare a chamber for winter were valued. The sheer quantity of textiles required to properly outfit a castle for winter was staggering. A single great chamber might need dozens of yards of fabric for wall hangings, more for curtains, and still more for bed hangings. Multiply this by the number of rooms in a castle, and the total could reach thousands of yards of fabric. The production, maintenance, and storage of these textiles was a major logistical challenge. Textile maintenance was labour-intensive. Fabrics accumulated dust, absorbed smoke from fires, and developed odours. They needed periodic cleaning, which for large wool hangings meant taking them down, beating them or brushing them clean, airing them, and then rehung. This might happen once or twice a year, often in spring after the worst of winter had passed. Damage to textiles, whether from moths, moisture, or simple wear, required repair. Skilled seamstresses would mend tears, patch holes, and refresh embroidery. In very wealthy households, this work was continuous, a cycle of taking down, cleaning, repairing, and rehanging that never truly ended. The combination of personal clothing layers and environmental textile barriers created multiple zones of insulation around a sleeping medieval person. Closest was the linen sleeping garment and nightcap. Then came the sheets, blankets, and coverlets. These were enclosed by bed curtains. The bed itself stood in a room with walls covered by hangings and windows curtained. Each layer contributed some insulation, and together they made the difference between dangerous cold and tolerable sleeping conditions. Modern people, accustomed to setting a thermostat and expecting consistent warmth, might struggle to fully appreciate the complexity of these medieval arrangements. Every element, from the simplest nightcap to the most elaborate tapestry, represented knowledge, labour, and resources devoted to the single goal of staying warm enough to survive. The medieval approach to cold was less about creating warmth, which was difficult given available technology, and more about preventing heat loss through careful barrier creation. The social geography of warmth. Medieval castles had a distinct geography of warmth, with some locations consistently warmer than others. Where you slept in the castle wasn't just a matter of status, though status certainly played a role, but also a matter of survival. Understanding this spatial distribution of heat reveals much about both medieval architecture and the social hierarchy that determined who had access to the warmest spots. The kitchens were the warmest spaces in any castle, and this remained true night and day. The massive hearths in castle kitchens, large enough to roast whole animals, burned continuously or near continuously. Even when no cooking was happening, these fires were typically kept alive to save the effort of rekindling them. The heat generated could be intense, to the point that kitchen workers in summer might find their workplace uncomfortably hot. This constant warmth made kitchens attractive sleeping locations, but access was limited. Kitchen staff, including cooks, scullions, and various helpers, had first claimed to sleep there. The warmth came with drawbacks. The kitchen was busy from before dawn until late at night, giving little opportunity for undisturbed sleep. The smell of cooking, old food, and general kitchen activity pervaded the space. Vermin, attracted by food, were common, but for those who secured a spot near the kitchen hearth, particularly in winter, these inconveniences were acceptable prices for genuine warmth. A servant sleeping on a pallet in the kitchen corner, even with the noise and smell, was far better off than one sleeping in an unheated corridor or tower room. The great hall, despite often having a large hearth or fireplace, showed extreme temperature variation depending on proximity to the heat source. Immediately around the fireplace, the area could be quite warm, even uncomfortably so at close range. But just 20 feet away, the temperature might be barely above freezing on a cold night. This created a pecking order for sleeping positions. Senior servants, those with more years of service or specific favour, claimed spots closest to the heat. Younger, newer, or lower status servants found themselves pushed progressively farther from the fireplace into colder and colder zones. The very newest or lowest ranking might end up near the outer walls or in drafty doorways, the least desirable locations. This wasn't formally organised with marked sleeping spots, though in some castles tradition might establish certain areas as belonging to certain groups. Rather, it was a nightly negotiation, with stronger or more assertive individuals claiming better spots, while others made do with what remained. Social bonds mattered. Servants who had formed alliances might huddle together in a group, sharing warmth and defending their chosen spot from encroachment. Private chambers varied widely in temperature depending on several factors. The most important was whether the chamber had its own fireplace. A room with a fireplace, where a fire could be maintained through the night, could be genuinely warm. Such rooms were rare and reserved for nobility or high-ranking guests. Chambers without fireplaces relied on warmth transmitted from other sources. A room above the kitchen benefited from rising heat, though this also brought cooking smells and the risk that a kitchen fire might spread. Rooms adjacent to the Great Hall might receive some warmth through shared walls, though stone transmitted heat poorly. Location within the castle's vertical structure mattered significantly. Ground floor rooms, though closer to damp earth, benefited from warmth rising from any fires below, and from the general concentration of people and activities on lower levels. Upper floor chambers, particularly those in towers, were consistently the coldest locations in the castle. This created a paradox. The highest status locations, those with the best views and greatest prestige, were often the coldest. Tower chambers placed there for security and prestige could be brutally cold in winter. Their height meant they were farthest from any heat source. Their wall surfaces were fully exposed to exterior cold, and wind around the tower tops created tremendous drafts. To make such chambers habitable required extraordinary measures. Multiple braziers might be necessary, along with the thickest possible wall hangings, the most elaborate bed curtains, and generous use of bed warmers. Even then, these rooms were cold by any reasonable standard. The privilege of sleeping in a tower came with the cost of cold, and nobles paid that cost for the prestige and security such locations offered. Corner rooms, where two exterior walls met, were particularly cold because they lost heat through both walls. Interior rooms, surrounded by other castle structures, were warmer because they had fewer exterior surfaces. The warmest possible sleeping location would be an interior room on a middle floor, positioned above the kitchens, with a fireplace of its own. Such ideal locations were rare, and when they existed, only the most privileged occupants had access. The lord and lady's personal chambers were typically positioned with warmth in mind, as much as security allowed. But even they often had to choose between warmth and other considerations like privacy, security, or aesthetic preferences. Guard rooms, where soldiers on duty waited between patrols or stood watches, were sometimes heated, though not always. A guard room near the main gate might have a brazier to keep the guards alert and comfortable, particularly in the depths of winter. But guards stationed in towers or on wall-walks had no such comfort. They endured the cold as part of their duty, relying on activity and layered clothing to maintain body temperature. Some castles had warming rooms, spaces specifically designated for the household to warm themselves when needed. These rooms had generous fireplaces and were kept heated during waking hours. While not typically used for sleeping, they offered respite during the day, allowing cold servants to warm up before returning to their tasks. Monasteries particularly embraced this concept, with the warming house being the only heated space where monks could go to escape the cold required by their ascetic lifestyle. The concept of heating efficiency, though not understood in modern thermodynamic terms, was certainly grasped practically. Medieval people knew that smaller rooms were easier to heat than large ones, that rooms with fewer windows retained heat better, and that positioning matters. This knowledge influenced castle design increasingly as the Middle Ages progressed, with later castles showing more consideration for livability than earlier, more purely military structures. Guest chambers presented special considerations. Important guests needed to be impressed and made comfortable, which meant access to heated spaces. A visiting noble or royal personage would be given the best chamber the castle could offer, likely one with a fireplace and positioned for maximum comfort. Lesser guests received correspondingly fewer warm accommodations. The provision of warmth to guests was part of the broader obligation of hospitality. A host who failed to keep important guests comfortable risked their reputation and might even give offence. Therefore, castle stewards ensured that guest chambers were properly prepared, with fires laid, bed curtains hung, and bed warmers employed. The temporary comfort of a guest might receive more resources than the permanent comfort of the castle's regular inhabitants. Servants' quarters, when they existed as separate structures rather than just communal sleeping spaces, showed the lowest level of heating consideration. These were often timber buildings in the bailey, drafty by nature and minimally heated. A single fireplace might serve dozens of servants. The buildings were functional, providing shelter from wind and rain but doing little against cold. This allocation of warmth reflected medieval social values. Comfort was not a right, but a privilege, distributed according to rank. Those at the top of the hierarchy had access to the warmest spaces, the best bedding, and the most resources for staying warm. Those at the bottom had to make do with whatever scraps of warmth remained after higher-ranked individuals had claimed their share. Yet this system, harsh as it seems, had a certain logic. Lords and ladies who made decisions and conducted business needed to be rested and healthy. Providing them with warm sleeping conditions wasn't just luxury but practical necessity. A lord who spent all night shivering would be ineffective at managing his lands and household. By ensuring the comfort of key individuals, the entire organisation functioned better. Servants, while less warm, weren't completely neglected. A wise lord knew that dead servants were useless, and servants too cold to work properly were nearly as bad. The provision of at least some warmth, whether through access to communal fires or tolerance of servants sleeping in warm kitchens, served the lord's interests. It was a balance. Provide enough warmth to keep servants alive and functional, but not so much as to waste resources. This pragmatic approach to warmth, like so much else in medieval life, seems harsh by modern standards. But it was functional given the constraints of the time. Resources were limited, heating technology was primitive, and fuel was expensive. The distribution of warmth followed the same hierarchical logic that governed everything else in medieval society. The spatial inequality of warmth in medieval castles reminds us that cold wasn't just an inconvenience, but a profound organizing principle. It shaped architecture, influenced social relationships, and literally determined life and death in extreme cases. Understanding this helps us appreciate the full context of medieval sleeping arrangements, which were never just about finding a place to lie down, but about negotiating a complex landscape of cold and scarce warmth. Regional and seasonal variations. Medieval Europe was not monolithic, and the challenges of sleeping in castles varied significantly based on geography and time of year. A castle in northern Scotland faced very different conditions than one in southern Italy, and winter preparations differed from summer arrangements. Understanding these variations reveals how medieval people adapted their strategies to local circumstances. Northern European castles, particularly those in Scotland, northern England, Scandinavia and parts of Germany, faced the longest and harshest winters. In these regions, winter could last from October through March, with periods of severe cold. Daylight hours shortened dramatically, and storms bringing snow, sleet and freezing rain were common. Castles in these areas were sometimes built with slightly more consideration for cold weather. Rooms tended to be somewhat smaller than in southern castles, making them easier to heat. Windows were kept very small, and multiple layers of shutters and coverings became standard. The architectural style evolved to include features that, while primarily defensive, also helped with insulation. In Scotland particularly, castles incorporated thick walls not just for defence but because the local climate demanded them. Some Scottish castles had walls 20 feet thick in places, creating deep window embrasures that could be shuttered to provide excellent insulation. These embrasures sometimes had internal wooden shutters in addition to external ones, creating an air gap that improved insulation. Fuel availability varied by region. Areas with extensive forests had ample firewood, though even here the labour of harvesting and transporting it was considerable. Scotland's remaining forests and England's increasingly managed woodlands provided wood, but peat became an important fuel source, particularly in areas where trees were scarce. Peat, cut from bogs and dried, burned slowly and could maintain fires overnight, though it produced a distinctive, sometimes unpleasant smell. Scandinavian castles, though not as common as in other parts of Europe due to political and geographic factors, incorporated lessons from Norse building traditions. These included provisions for maintaining fires, careful attention to draft prevention, and sometimes the use of wooden interior panelling that provided better insulation than bare stone. Mediterranean castles faced different challenges. In southern France, Spain, and Italy, winters were milder but not absent. A castle in Provence or Tuscany might rarely see snow, and prolonged freezing temperatures were unusual. But winter nights could still be cold, and stone buildings without heating were uncomfortable. Mediterranean castles were often designed with summer heat in mind. Large windows admitted breezes, high ceilings allowed hot air to rise away from occupants, and courtyards created air circulation. These features, wonderful in August, became liabilities in January. The same large windows that cooled in summer created drafts in winter. The high ceilings that allowed hot air to escape instead allowed heat to rise away from occupants. Seasonal preparation in these southern castles was less intensive than in the north. Wall hangings might be thinner and fewer layers of bed coverings sufficed, but heating was still necessary and fireplaces were still important. The milder climate meant that less fuel was needed, which was fortunate because fuel availability in some Mediterranean regions was limited due to deforestation. Climate during the medieval period was not constant. The medieval warm period, roughly from the 10th to 13th centuries, brought generally warmer temperatures than the preceding or following eras. During this time, sleeping in castles was somewhat less challenging, though still cold by modern standards. Winters were less severe and less fuel was needed for heating. This changed with the onset of the Little Ice Age, beginning in the 14th century and lasting into the 19th century. During this period, winters became significantly colder across Europe. Rivers that had rarely frozen began to ice over regularly. Crops failed due to shorter growing seasons, and fuel demands increased as people struggled to stay warm. Castles that had been reasonably comfortable during the medieval warm period became much more challenging during the Little Ice Age. Existing heating systems, barely adequate before, became insufficient. More fireplaces were added to castles, more wall hangings installed, and fuel consumption increased dramatically. Contemporary accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries frequently mention the cold, suggesting that people noticed and struggled with the changing climate. Seasonal variations affected even individual castles. Summer sleeping arrangements were quite different from winter ones. In summer, the challenge might be too much heat rather than too little, particularly in Mediterranean regions. Bed curtains would be replaced with lighter fabrics or removed entirely to allow air circulation. Windows would be opened rather than shuttered, and fireplaces would be used minimally or not at all except for cooking. In northern castles, summer provided brief respite from cold. The stone walls that radiated cold in winter would finally warm through, sometimes making summer nights actually pleasant. But this warmth took months to accumulate, The stones were still releasing winter's cold well into May, and by September they were beginning to chill again. The transitional seasons, spring and autumn, required constant adjustment. A castle household needed to judge when to bring out heavy winter hangings and when to store them away. Bringing them out too early wasted effort. Keeping them out too long meant enduring unnecessary cold. Similarly, when to begin banking large fires each night, when to begin using bed warmers, and when to stop these practices required judgment. These decisions were typically made by the castle's steward, or, in smaller households, by the lady of the castle. They would balance fuel conservation against comfort, trying to extend limited resources through the entire cold season without letting anyone suffer unduly. It was a complex calculation that varied year to year depending on weather patterns, fuel supplies, and the household's means. Coastal castles faced particular challenges. Proximity to the sea brought moisture-laden air that made cold feel more penetrating. Damp cold, as anyone who has experienced it knows, is far more uncomfortable than dry cold of the same temperature. Stone walls in coastal castles would literally weep with condensation, and fabrics would absorb moisture from the air. Fighting dampness became a major concern in these locations. Fires needed to be maintained not just for heat but to dry the air. Wall hangings might be periodically taken down and aired to prevent mildew. Bedding needed special attention, sheets and blankets required regular airing, and mattresses needed to be rotated and dried to prevent rot. Highland castles, built on exposed hilltops for defensive advantage, faced tremendous wind. The wind chill effect, though not understood scientifically, was certainly felt, and medieval people knew that castles in windy locations were colder than those in sheltered valleys. Everything that could be done to block drafts became doubly important in these locations. Valley castles, by contrast, might benefit from some shelter from wind, but often faced increased fog and moisture. Each location had its trade-offs, and sleeping arrangements needed to adapt to local conditions. The availability of certain resources varied regionally and affected sleeping comfort. Areas with thriving wool production could provide abundant wool blankets and felt. Regions near trade routes might have access to imported luxuries like silk or expensive furs. Remote or poor regions made do with whatever was locally available. This regional variation in resources created corresponding variation in sleeping arrangements. A wealthy castle in Flanders, centre of medieval wool and textile production, might have access to the finest wool fabrics for wall hangings, bed curtains and blankets. A remote castle in the Scottish Highlands might have to make do with coarser local materials, though seal skins or other local resources might provide alternatives not available elsewhere. Cultural differences also played a role. Different regions had different traditions around sleep, modesty and comfort. Some areas embraced co-sleeping more readily, while others valued privacy more highly when resources allowed. Religious variations, whether Catholic, Orthodox or later Protestant, influenced attitudes toward bodily comfort and asceticism. Despite these variations, certain universal truths applied. Everywhere in medieval Europe, sleeping in stone castles during winter was cold. Everywhere, staying warm required effort, resources and strategy. Everywhere, social status determined access to the warmest sleeping arrangements. The specific details varied, but the fundamental challenge remained constant. Understanding these regional and seasonal variations reminds us that medieval life was not uniform. A castle in Norway in January was a very different environment from a castle in Sicily in October. Medieval people developed locally adapted solutions to sleeping in cold castles, solutions that drew on available resources and reflected accumulated knowledge about surviving in their particular environment. Daily routines and nighttime realities. The actual experience of sleeping in a medieval castle involved more than just the physical arrangements we've discussed. Daily routines around sleep, the realities of nighttime activities, and the challenges of waking and rising all contributed to the overall experience. Understanding these details brings us closer to the lived reality of medieval castle inhabitants. The evening routine began well before actual bedtime. As daylight faded, which in northern winters might be as early as 4 in the afternoon, the castle gradually prepared for night. Servants began closing shutters on windows, a room-by-room process that could take an hour or more in a large castle. Each shutter needed to be pulled closed and secured with bars or hooks, and any curtains needed to be drawn across for additional protection. Simultaneously, fires throughout the castle needed attention. Those in regularly occupied spaces, like the Great Hall and kitchens, were built up for the evening, when people would gather for meals and warmth. Fires in chambers that would be used for sleeping were started or built up, heating the rooms in preparation for occupation. This timing was crucial. Starting fires too early wasted fuel. Starting them too late meant people would retire to cold rooms. The evening meal, typically served in the Great Hall in later afternoon or early evening, was the day's main social gathering. Everyone from the lord to the lowest servant would be present, though seated according to rank. The meal provided not just nutrition, but also warmth, both from the hot food and from the crowded hall. Bodies huddled together around tables, and the general activity generated heat. After the meal came a period of evening activities that varied by social class. Lords and ladies might retire to private chambers for conversation, reading, or entertainment. Servants cleared the meal and began preparing the hall for sleeping. This involved moving or disassembling trestle tables, sweeping the floor of food scraps and bones, and refreshing rushes if needed. Pallets and sleeping mats were brought out from daytime storage and laid in their spots. For those with private chambers, evening preparations were more elaborate. A servant would arrive with the bed warmer, going through the ritual of heating the bed that we've discussed. Other servants brought water for washing, though in winter this might be minimal to avoid discomfort. Chamber pots were positioned within reach of the bed, necessary because venturing into cold corridors to reach a garderobe at night was extremely unpleasant. Undressing for bed required strategy. The room, even with a fire burning, was cold. People would undress quickly, removing outer garments but often keeping on underlayers. The trick was to get under the bed coverings as quickly as possible before cold penetrated. Women with long hair would take time to braid it and cover it, a concession to practicality over speed. Once in bed, behind closed curtains, the sleeper entered a personal microclimate. The heavy bed coverings, already warmed by the bed warmer, trapped body heat. Within 15 or 20 minutes, the space within the curtains would be genuinely warm, a dramatic contrast to the cold room beyond. This warmth was precious and not to be surrendered lightly. But night's darkness brought challenges. Medieval nights were dark in ways difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Without streetlights, car headlights, or interior electric lighting, darkness was complete. A cloudy night with no moon was utterly black. Even within a castle, unless a fire or candle burned, darkness was absolute. Candles were expensive, made from tallow or, for the wealthy, beeswax. Keeping candles burning all night was wasteful, so they were typically extinguished at bedtime. Fires in chambers might be banked, covered with ash to preserve coals for morning, but they provided little light. This darkness was both familiar and unnerving to medieval people, who populated the night with spiritual and natural dangers. The sounds of night were constant. Stone structures transmitted sound effectively, and medieval people had little expectation of quiet. In the Great Hall, dozens of people sleeping created a symphony of snores, coughs, and sleep mutterings. Animals might be heard, dogs kept inside for warmth and security, or rats scurrying in walls and rafters. Wind would moan through gaps and around towers. Wooden timbers would creak as temperature changes caused expansion and contraction. Guards on night watch called out at regular intervals, announcing that all was well. These calls, echoing through the castle, provided both security and disruption. Everyone knew the watch was being kept, but the regular shouts also disturbed sleep. Castle dwellers learned to sleep through these familiar noises, though strangers or guests often found the cacophony disturbing. The need to urinate during the night was common, particularly given the quantities of weak ale that medieval people drank. For nobles in chambers with curtained beds, this meant emerging from warmth into cold, fumbling for the chamber pot in darkness, and then returning to bed to regain warmth. For servants sleeping in communal spaces, it might mean navigating crowded sleeping areas to reach a designated spot, or even venturing outside to the guardrobe or latrine pit. These nighttime excursions were genuinely unpleasant in winter. The cold was shocking after the relative warmth of bed or sleeping pile. The darkness made navigation hazardous. Chamber pots might freeze, their contents forming ice. The urgency of bladder demands conflicted with the desire to stay warm, creating a genuine dilemma that many medieval people addressed by simply urinating into chamber pots at their bedside, or, in communal sleeping areas, in designated corners. Sleep itself was different for medieval people. Some